The bomber stream was already up when the weather closed, as if someone had drawn a curtain across the continent. From the waist window of a heavy bomber climbing into the gray, there was no England left, no hedgerows, no villages, no coast, only layered cloud, the dull glow of morning trapped above it, and a thin vibration in the airframe that told the crew their world had narrowed to aluminum, instruments, and breath. The condensation froze along seams and rivet lines where the heat couldn't reach. At altitude, the cold did not announce itself with drama. It arrived as a kind of theft, stealing feeling from fingers, stealing moisture from lungs, stealing patience from men who already knew what waited across the channel. In the nose compartment, hunched over a table lit by a shaded lamp, the navigator kept his pencil moving even when his glove made the graphite skid. He was young enough that his face still carried softness under the oxygen mask, yet his eyes had the fixed attention of someone who had learned early that mistakes did not care how hard you tried. Back home, people would have called him a farm boy because the word explained him in a single breath. Quiet, practical, raised on weather and distance, taught to measure the day by the sun and the work by the field. In the Army Air Forces, navigator meant something different. It meant the man who tried to put certainty into a place where certainty was always being erased. Outside, nothing offered reference. The bomber climbed through thick cloud, and the aircraft felt blind in a way that made even confident men careful with their voices. The pilot held the yoke as if it were fragile, small corrections only, letting the autopilot carry most of the burden. The engines droned in 4 steady tones, occasionally shifting when the prop governors adjusted. Somewhere in the formation, other crews were doing the same, dozens, then hundreds of aircraft, trying to become a single moving mass without ever seeing one another clearly. When the clouds thickened, the formation might as well have been an idea rather than a physical thing. The navigator's charts were already marked with the route and its timed legs, but paper plans were only the beginning. The moment wheels left runway, wind began rewriting everything. The navigator checked the airspeed, then the heading, then the estimated drift. He wrote numbers small and tight, the way his instructors had insisted, because large handwriting invited carelessness. He had a stopwatch running, the kind of object that looked harmless until a crew depended on it to find the turning point over occupied Europe. He listened to the interphone, to the scattered radio calls from other aircraft and controllers, and he learned what the weather was doing not through sight but through the sound of strain in other men's voices. The contradiction sat at the center of the mission. They were going to Berlin, and they could barely see their own wings. Berlin meant distance first. It meant hours over enemy territory, which meant exposure to flat corridors, to fighter control zones, to the geometry of interception. It meant fuel margins that tightened with any detour or climb, oxygen that became precious if leaks developed, and crews who would return with frostbite and fatigue even if no one fired a shot. Berlin also meant weight. Every man in the aircraft understood the name carried more than a target grid. It carried politics, morale, and the blunt message of reach. It was the sort of mission that planners believed could not be postponed forever, even if conditions were poor, because postponement had its own cost in momentum and pressure. Yet for the crews who flew it, Berlin was not abstract. It was a line drawn across maps that would translate into minutes counted under strain. The navigator was not the one who would open bomb bay doors. He would not be the one who tried to fight off a diving fighter with twin Brownings. His power was quieter and more absolute. His calculations decided whether they arrived over the target in a coherent stream, able to cover each other, able to hold the bombing run together, or whether the force fractured into scattered pieces that German radar and fighters could pick apart one by one. In training films, navigation was shown as clean lines and calm hands. In reality, it was a steady argument against uncertainty. Wind changed. Clouds hid checkpoints. Radio bearings wavered, and every adjustment the navigator made, every degree of correction, grew into miles over time. He worked methodically, because method was the only defense against the creeping panic that came from not knowing. He checked the compass and compared it with the gyro. He recorded the forecast wind, and then tried to infer the real wind from their drift and ground speed. He made notes about the icing, because icing meant drag. Drag meant speed loss, and speed loss altered every time estimate. He listened for any mention of bombers straying from assembly points, any request for position checks, any hint that the stream was spreading. On days like this, the navigator's world became a series of invisible lines, headings that existed only on a dial, distances measured only by time, and the faith that those instruments still told the truth. In the crew compartment behind him, the men settled into the long posture of a mission. The radio operator adjusted his frequencies and tried to separate useful signals from the wash of static. Gunners checked their guns again, not because they expected immediate action, but because routine was a way to hold anxiety down. The engineer watched engine gauges and cylinder head temperatures with the attention of a man tending a living thing. The bombardier, up front with the navigator, sat in a silence that was not calm so much as waiting. Everyone understood there would be moments later when actions came fast, but for now the danger was slower and more intimate. The slow accumulation of small errors and small failures. The navigator had been trained to love landmarks, rivers, rail lines, coast shapes, the clean assurance of a city outlined beneath clear air. But today there were no landmarks. The world outside was a pale blank, occasionally shifting in shade when the aircraft passed through different cloud layers. The navigator's job became almost purely internal. He leaned close to his chart, then back to the instruments, then to his own notes. His mind moved through a mental landscape of angles and wind vectors. It was the kind of work that could feel calm if you trusted your system. But he had seen what happened when men trusted too much. A wrong turn could place a bomber group over the wrong flak battery. A drift uncorrected could mean missing a rendezvous with escorts. A scattered formation could mean a lone aircraft becoming an easy target. Somewhere in the gray, the bomber stream continued to climb and shape itself. The navigator imagined the scale because he had to. 900 bombers were not 900 separate flights. They were supposed to be an organized force, arriving in timed waves, turning at planned points, merging into lanes. The air war had taught both sides that mass mattered. It created overlapping fields of fire, complicated interception, forced enemy fighters to attack under pressure. But mass also demanded discipline and alignment, and the weather threatened both. The navigator could not command other crews, could not see their positions, could not force them to hold tight. What he could do was keep his aircraft on the best possible track and feed that discipline back into the stream through procedures, signals, and timing. His Farmboy steadiness was not heroism. It was the refusal to hurry the pencil, the refusal to accept a guess when a calculation could be made. It was the habit of checking work twice, because the cost of a mistake was never theoretical. He had grown up watching storms form over fields, watching them shift by the hour, learning that nature did not negotiate. Now, in a bomber at altitude, he faced the same truth in a different language. The weather was not an inconvenience. It was an operational force, one that could kill men without ever firing a shot. As the aircraft leveled at cruising altitude, the navigator began the first long leg with his stopwatch and his notes, and the crew's world settled into a rhythm. Engine noise, oxygen breath, pencil scratch, radio static. Over the interphone, the pilot asked for confirmation of heading and time to the next checkpoint. The navigator answered with numbers, and there was a brief pause afterward, just enough to reveal the weight behind those numbers. Outside, clouds still covered everything. Somewhere ahead lay the coastline of occupied Europe, then the deep interior of Germany, then Berlin. Nothing could be seen. Yet the mission required coherence, and coherence required that the invisible work in the nose compartment hold against the gray. If the sky refused to provide landmarks, the navigator would have to build them from time, wind, and discipline. And if he failed, it would not look like failure in the moment. It would look like a gradual drift, an unnoticed separation, a bomber stream dissolving into aircraft, each one suddenly alone in the most defended airspace in Europe. The contradiction remained, quiet and unyielding. Visibility was gone, yet the formation had to move as one. Bomber Command did not point 900 aircraft at Berlin because the sky looked friendly. It did it because Berlin was the kind of target that made every other target feel smaller. In the arithmetic of a strategic air war, distance and symbolism were not separate categories. The capital sat deep enough inside Germany that simply reaching it proved a claim, that the Reich's defenses could be penetrated, that its population could be made to feel the war overhead, and that the industrial spine feeding the front could be struck even when it was wrapped in layers of anti-aircraft guns and fighter bases. When planners talked about pressure, they meant more than damage to factories. They meant the constant draining of German fuel, aircraft, spare parts, and trained pilots forced into the air day after day. A Berlin mission demanded that drain at the very center of the system. It forced the Luftwaffe to respond, and response itself was a form of erosion. The weather did not erase the logic. It complicated it. Cloud could blunt the accuracy of bombing, and commanders knew that. But cloud also changed the terms of survival. A clear day over Berlin meant every flak battery could see the stream and walk shells into it with measured certainty. It meant fighters could pick out stragglers at range and choose their attack angles. Bad weather, for all its cruelty, could hide a bomber's approach, distort radar pictures, and interrupt visual coordination. It could also kill crews without enemy involvement by freezing carburetors, icing wings, and turning formation flight into a slow-motion collision hazard. The decision to go was never simply good weather versus bad weather. It was a calculation made by men who believed that time itself was an enemy. Delay meant German defenses improved, meant factories dispersed, meant crews sat on bases while the calendar turned, and the war demanded movement. 900 bombers sounded like a single, immense hammer. But in reality, it was a chain of fragile links. It began in darkness across multiple airfields where engines were started in staggered waves, each aircraft burning precious fuel just to reach assembly altitude. Crews climbed into freezing compartments, pulled on masks, and trusted that the others would appear at the right place in time. Assembly was the first test of any large raid, and on a cloud day it became a gamble played with instruments. Groups were assigned specific climb routes and holding patterns, each with time windows measured in minutes. Too early and a group could drift into another's airspace. Too late and it could miss its place in the stream and be forced to chase it, burning fuel and increasing the odds of isolation. Once assembled, the stream depended on discipline that most civilians never imagine. Radio silence was often a rule, not because commanders loved quiet, but because noise was information, and German direction finding units could turn careless transmissions into a map. Visual signals, wing woggles, lights, flares, helped when visibility allowed, but cloud turned them into faint ghosts. The bomber stream therefore became a kind of moving timetable. Each group had a slot. Each slot had a speed, and speed had to be held even when icing built on leading edges and engines strained at altitude. A few miles per hour too fast could compress spacing until prop wash shook aircraft. A few miles per hour too slow could open gaps wide enough for fighters to dive through. The stream was not a parade. It was a managed flow where small deviations accumulated into structural failure. Routing mattered because routing was protection. Planners selected corridors that balanced risk, avoid the densest flak belts when possible, timed the approach so escorts could cover the most dangerous segments, and shaped the stream so it did not present easy opportunities for massed interception. Predictability was both asset and liability. Predictability helped 900 aircraft remain coherent. Predictability also allowed German radar operators and fighter controllers to anticipate where the stream would be when. A raid to Berlin could not be hidden in the long run. It was too large, too slow, too obvious in its trajectory. What could be altered were details. A turn point here, an altitude there, the timing of a penetration. In clear weather, those details were easier to execute. In cloud, the same details could dissolve, and the stream's predictability could become accidental rather than planned. On the German side, the defense was a system built around time and information. Radar stations along the coast and inland provided early warning, but radar was not a magic eye that showed perfect pictures. It produced returns that had to be interpreted, and weather could smear those returns and complicate tracking. Once plots were formed, they moved through command channels that decided which fighter units to launch, which routes to assign, and where to concentrate effort. German fighter control was not merely pilots hunting on instinct. It was organized interception. Controllers could place fighters above a stream and push them down into it, or position them along a likely corridor and let the bombers come to them. Cloud could break this precision. It could also create opportunities, because a bomber stream forced to navigate by instruments might drift into predictable zones anyway, especially if wind pushed it. For German controllers, cloud was both interference and a tool, depending on which side made fewer mistakes. Flak belts were the other constant. Anti-aircraft defenses were layered. Lighter guns closer to targets, heavier batteries placed along approach routes, and concentrations around key cities. Berlin itself was ringed by defenses that were not merely numerous but practiced. On clear days, crews described flak as black flowers blooming in the sky, timed bursts that seemed to anticipate where the bomber would be. In cloud, the visual element changed, but the threat did not vanish. Radar-directed flak could still reach through weather, and a bomber forced to fly predictable headings on instruments could still be bracketed by guns firing on calculated tracks. The difference was psychological as much as tactical. When crews could see bursts, they could at least understand where danger was. When clouds swallowed everything, flak became something you felt rather than saw. The sudden jolt, the metallic slap of fragments, the brief shudder that ran through the airframe like an animal trying to shake off pain. This was where the mission's internal contradiction sharpened into something operational. Cloud could protect bombers from fighters by making visual acquisition difficult, by forcing pilots to hesitate before committing to an attack they could not fully see. Yet cloud could also fracture the stream, and fragmentation was the oldest invitation to attack. A lone aircraft, separated from its box, became visible by its exhaust, by its contrail if it climbed above the layer, by the simple fact that it was one target rather than a wall of guns. The Germans did not need to destroy 900 bombers. They only needed to turn a portion of them into singles and pairs, because singles and pairs were manageable. Inside one aircraft, the Navigator's work sat at the center of this tension. The planner's logic depended on coherence. The German defenses thrived on disorder. The weather threatened coherence while also offering moments of concealment. The Navigator could not control the sky, could not change the mission's political importance, could not affect how many fighters the Luftwaffe launched. What he could do was preserve the integrity of his place in the stream, keep time and heading so his aircraft remained part of something larger than itself. That was why Berlin mattered in the first place, not only for what would be hit, but for what would be proven about reach and discipline. In a war fought across maps and factories, the human unit of effort was still a crew in a cold aircraft, trusting a pencil, a stopwatch, and the calm competence of one man whose job was to make the invisible path real. Dead reckoning was the foundation because it worked even when everything else failed. The Navigator would take a planned heading, adjust it for forecast winds, and then watch the clock as the aircraft moved into the unknown. The math was simple in isolation and cruel in accumulation. A small drift angle sustained for hours could shift a formation miles off course, enough to turn a planned corridor into a flak belt. The Navigator tracked ground speed by comparing true airspeed with wind, a calculation that lived somewhere between physics and guesswork. In clear weather, visual checkpoints, coastlines, rivers, rail junctions confirmed whether the numbers were honest. In cloud, those confirmations were taken away, and dead reckoning became not just a method, but an act of discipline, continuing to compute when the world provided no reassurance. The bomber's instruments were supposed to be that reassurance, but they were not a single truth. They were a committee of devices, each one capable of lying in its own way. The magnetic compass could wander under electrical interference or the aircraft's own metal influence. The gyro compass could persist slowly, drifting like a sleepwalker if it wasn't periodically corrected. The airspeed indicator could be wrong in icing, or wrong because the pitot tube had started to freeze, or wrong because the instrument had been jarred hard on a rough landing the day before. Even the altimeter, the most trusted dial in the cockpit, could carry subtle error if the pressure setting was off or if the crew climbed through fast-changing air masses. Navigation depended on agreement. When the instruments disagreed, the navigator had to decide which lie was closest to truth. He had learned this not from heroic stories, but from long, quiet mistakes in training. A good instructor did not let a student fail dramatically. He let the student fail slightly, and then made him feel how that small failure multiplied. It was a lesson that fit a farm boy's mind. On a farm, weather did not arrive as a single event. It shifted across hours, changing the feel of the air, turning a planned harvest into a mud field, turning an easy day into one where a man simply had to keep working without reward. Patience was not a virtue you performed. It was a tool you used. Repetition did not bore you if your life depended on doing it right. That background didn't make the navigator special. It made him comfortable with the kind of labor that modern war demanded from specialists. Hours of focused attention with no applause. On the Berlin mission, that attention was tested early, before the bomber stream even crossed the coast. The pre-brief weather reports had promised layers, but reports were words, and the sky was reality. The aircraft climbed into cloud thicker than expected, and the navigator felt the first quiet warning when his planned timing stopped matching the aircraft's behavior. Icing increased drag. Drag reduced speed. Reduced speed changed every estimate. In the neat world of a mission plan, each leg ended at a set minute. In the real world of thick air and ice, that minute became elastic. He corrected, then corrected again, building a revised schedule in the margins of his chart. Each adjustment was small, but each one was a reminder. The plan on paper was already being rewritten. Radio aids were supposed to help when landmarks disappeared. They were also fragile. A radio compass could take bearings from known stations, giving the navigator a line of position. 2 bearings could create a fix. But in wartime airspace, the ether was crowded and often hostile. Signals could fade as the bomber climbed, or be distorted by atmospheric conditions, or be drowned in static. The Germans jammed when they could, and even when they didn't, the sheer distance could make a station's signal bend and wobble. The navigator listened for the clean tone of a reliable beacon, then heard it break into a fluttering hiss. He tried another frequency. That one was worse. The radio operator, speaking in a controlled voice that implied strain, reported interference that might be weather, might be enemy, might be simply the reality of 900 aircraft and countless ground stations all pushing energy into the same sky. So the navigator returned to what he could control. He plotted wind from what the aircraft was doing, not what the forecast had said. If he could not see the ground, he could still infer drift from subtle cues. Changes in heading required to hold formation position, changes in the feel of the aircraft as the pilot corrected, and the way the bomber's progress along the timeline either matched or diverged from expectation. He watched the clock like a man watching a field drain after rain, knowing that time itself was an element he could measure even when everything else was obscured. He wrote down each correction because memory was not reliable when oxygen dried the mouth and cold numbed the hands. There was also the human chain inside the aircraft, another weak link that could either hold or fail. The pilot depended on the navigator for headings and turn points, but the pilot also had to keep the aircraft in its place in the formation, a task that became harder the less he could see. The navigator had to translate his calculations into brief, usable instructions that did not flood the cockpit with numbers. Too much information became noise. Too little became dangerous. He learned the rhythm. Provide heading, provide estimated time to next point, provide drift correction, then stay quiet unless something changed. On the interphone, voices were clipped, professional, and occasionally thin with fatigue even though the mission had barely begun. The crew was settling into the long strain of flying blind. Instrument quirks appeared like small irritations at first, then demanded attention. The drift meter, meant to help measure how the aircraft slid over the ground, was useless in solid cloud because it required a visible surface. The navigator's pencil began to wear down quickly, forcing him to sharpen it with numb fingers. The chart table lamp flickered once, then steadied. Tiny problems, but they stacked. War did not usually break a man with one dramatic failure. It broke him with accumulations, with the steady pressure of many small demands that never stopped arriving. The navigator felt the psychological weight of that accumulation because he understood what his job meant in a mass raid. If his aircraft drifted off course, it could pull others with it. If the stream fractured, German defenses would not need brilliance. They would only need to exploit isolation. That knowledge did not make him panic. It made him careful. There was a particular calm that came from accepting responsibility without pretending you could dominate the situation. He could not command the clouds. He could not guarantee the radio would clear. He could not force the instruments to behave. What he could do was keep the procedure intact. Measure, compute, record, correct, repeat. By the time the bomber stream pushed toward the channel crossing, the navigator's chart already looked less like a clean plan and more like a working document, filled with small notes and revised numbers. That was not failure. That was the process of turning a paper route into something real enough to follow through cloud. The Farmboy's steadiness showed itself not in bravery, but in endurance. The ability to keep making careful decisions while the world outside remained blank. The mission had not yet met the enemy in a direct sense, but the navigator could feel the first truth of the day settling in his chest. The greatest threat to a formation in weather like this was not what waited over Berlin. It was the possibility of losing the path before they ever reached it. The cloud layers thickened in a way that didn't feel like weather anymore. It felt like terrain, something the bomber stream had to cross and could be injured by even if no one fired a shot. At first it was only a dimming, the sunlight above turning flat and colorless, the horizon dissolving into the same gray as the wings. Then it became total. The outside world disappeared so completely that the aircraft seemed to be flying through a featureless tunnel, and the men aboard began to understand how much of their confidence had been borrowed from sight. When you can see another bomber off your wing, you can measure distance with your eyes and adjust with instinct. When you can't, every correction becomes an act of faith in instruments and procedure. In a mass raid, faith was never supposed to be part of the plan, but the cloud invited it anyway. Formation spacing widened without anyone choosing it. A lead ship would fade, then reappear as a darker smear, then fade again. The pilot held the aircraft steady on the last known position, adjusting with small, careful movements that felt almost timid compared to the aggressive control inputs pilots used in clear air to keep tight. He spoke less. The interphone carried only the essentials: altitude, power settings, headings, because long conversations made men breathe harder into their oxygen masks, and breathing harder made them thirstier, and thirst in a frozen compartment became another distraction. In the waist, gunners leaned toward their windows and saw nothing, not even the comforting white scars of contrails. The contrails were gone, swallowed by the moisture and the layered air. And without them, the sky looked empty even when it wasn't. The navigator felt that emptiness as pressure in the chest rather than fear in the gut. Fear was loud and obvious. This was quieter. It was the awareness that the stream's cohesion was being tested by something that couldn't be shot down. He kept his pencil moving, but now the numbers had to do more than guide one aircraft. They had to preserve a place in a structure the crew could no longer see. Time, speed, distance became the only reliable landscape. He marked each minute as if it were a milepost on a road no one could look at. He estimated drift not by watching the ground, but by watching the aircraft's behavior. The subtle changes in engine note as the pilot added power to compensate for icing. The slight variations in airspeed that suggested the bomber was laboring against thicker air. The way the schedule began to slip and then slip again. Not dramatically, but in increments that accumulated. Icing was the first physical reminder that the cloud was hostile. It formed along the leading edges with the patience of something that knew it had time. At first it was a light roughness, then a thicker accretion that changed the wing's shape and made the aircraft feel heavier. The engineer called out readings in a steady voice, and the pilot responded with small adjustments, trying to maintain speed without burning fuel at a rate that would haunt them hours later. The engine sounded different in this air, muted, as if the cloud dampened the vibration and stole the crispness from the propeller beat. The navigator accounted for the new reality with a grim practicality. Drag meant slower ground speed. Slower ground speed meant later turns. And later turns meant escort timing becoming uncertain. Escort fighters were scheduled like clockwork, but clockwork depended on everyone arriving where they were supposed to be. The cloud made every rendezvous conditional. The risk profile of the mission changed in the cloud. Fighters could be blunted by poor visibility, but collisions became a real possibility. A bomber could emerge from gray at close range, a sudden shape with wings and propellers and a tail that filled a window. In clear air, crews kept spacing by constant visual correction. In cloud, spacing became a number, an altitude separation, a heading difference, a timed interval. And numbers could be wrong. Altimeter settings could drift. Pressure could change. A small error could place two aircraft in the same slice of sky without either crew knowing until the last seconds. The pilot began calling out altimeter checks more often. The navigator listened, not because altitude was his job, but because he needed a mental model of the stream's vertical layers to understand how safe they were from one another. He pictured the bombers stacked like shelves in a warehouse, each one separated by a few hundred feet and a few seconds of distance. And he understood how fragile that shelving became when no one could see. Disorientation arrived as fatigue rather than panic. Men were trained to trust instruments, but trust is a muscle, and the longer you fly without visual reference, the more that muscle aches. A pilot could hold a heading for an hour and still feel, irrationally, that the aircraft was turning. A navigator could compute a wind correction and still wonder if the wind had shifted again. Even gunners felt it, scanning blank windows until their eyes strained, then looking away and seeing phantom shapes in the corner of vision. The oxygen masks added to it. Each breath was dry, slightly metallic, and the straps pressed into cheeks and temples. The mask turned every man into a small closed system, breathing and thinking inside rubber and frost. Hypoxia was always a shadow threat. A loose connection, a regulator that froze, a hose that cracked. None of it announced itself with drama. It arrived as confusion, as a man forgetting a procedure he'd repeated 100 times, as a voice becoming slow on the interphone. The navigator guarded against that by writing more, not less. He wrote because paper didn't become dizzy. He wrote because numbers, once recorded, could be checked. He checked the heading against the gyro, then cross-checked the gyro against the magnetic compass, then noted the discrepancy. He recalculated drift, not from sight, but from the difference between planned and actual timings. He asked the pilot for airspeed changes, because even a 5-mile-per-hour variation mattered over distance. He listened for any mention of other groups, any radio signal hinting at formation compression or widening. The radio operator, fighting interference, occasionally pulled in a faint beacon tone. The navigator plotted a line of bearing that wavered like a weak pencil stroke, and even that uncertain line felt like a lifeline because it was something external, a reference that existed outside their sealed compartment. As the cloud thickened further, crews began measuring time in a different way, not in hours to target, but in manageable segments. Minutes to the next computed turn, minutes to the next expected escort link up, minutes until they could reassess winds. The mind could tolerate 10 minutes of uncertainty more easily than 3 hours. The navigator understood that, and he built his workload around it. Short legs, frequent checks, repeated recalculations. He made the mission smaller so it wouldn't crush the crew under its full scale. In this, too, the Farmboy background mattered without romance. On a farm, you didn't think about finishing the whole harvest at once. You thought about the next row, the next field, the next hour before the weather changed again. War demanded the same mental economy. The strain began to show in small human moments. A gunner flexed fingers inside thick gloves, trying to keep blood moving. The engineer rubbed a frost line off a gauge lens with a knuckle. The pilot swallowed hard, throat dry, then asked the navigator for the next turn again, needing the reassurance of a number. The navigator gave it calmly, and in that calm was a form of leadership the crew rarely named. He was not in command, yet his voice carried the structure of the mission, the sense that there was still a path even when no one could see it. By the time the bomber's stream pressed toward the deeper corridor, the cloud had done its work. It had widened spacing, strained escort timing, and turned every man inward toward instruments and procedure. The navigator's calculations were no longer simply guidance. They were terrain, the only landscape the crew could move across. Outside, the world was blank. Inside, the pencil, the clock, and the steady exchange of headings and times kept the aircraft tethered to a formation that existed mostly as an idea. That idea, coherence, was what kept a bomber alive in enemy airspace. And the cloud, indifferent and patient, continued to test whether the idea could hold. The first real sign that the stream was sliding off its intended track did not arrive with an explosion. It arrived as a small mismatch between expectation and sensation, the kind of mismatch a tired mind could ignore if it wanted to. The navigator had been counting minutes to a turn point that should have placed them over a specific corridor of airspace, one chosen because it balanced risk and timing. When the moment came, the aircraft felt no different, the engines still holding their muted note in the thick air, the clouds still blanket every window. Yet the next leg began with a subtle unease, because the time it took to reach the following checkpoint did not match what the numbers said it should. The difference was not dramatic, just a few minutes, the kind of discrepancy a man could blame on icing drag or a slight variation in power. But the navigator had lived long enough with wind and distance to know that small differences were never alone. They were the first visible tip of a larger drift. Radio calls began to leak through the discipline like water through a seam. A group leader, trying to keep his voice calm, asked for a bearing confirmation. Another transmission, shorter and sharper, asked whether anyone had visual contact with the lead element. The answers were incomplete. Some aircraft reported seeing nothing but cloud. Others reported momentary silhouettes, and then nothing again. No one could provide the kind of certainty that would settle the question. In the navigation compartment, the pencil kept moving, the chart filling with small corrections. But the navigator felt the pressure rise because the mission was no longer only about reaching Berlin. It was about reaching Berlin as a force rather than as scattered individuals. The German defense system did not need perfect information to exploit a broken stream. It only needed enough chaos to turn a massed raid into isolated targets. The cloud, which had felt like a shield at times, began to reveal its other nature. It didn't simply hide aircraft from fighters. It hid aircraft from each other, without contrails, without the long white signatures that normally marked the bomber stream like chalk lines. The sky offered no confirmation that they were still part of something larger. The tail gunner, staring into gray, reported occasional movement at the edge of his vision that vanished when he tried to focus. The waist gunners leaned toward their windows and saw nothing at all, not even the comforting indication of a neighboring ship's exhaust. The pilot flew by instruments and by the last known position of other aircraft, but last known positions were fragile in a moving formation. The navigator listened to the interphone traffic and understood that the formation spacing was changing. It wasn't compressing into the tight geometry the planners wanted. It was spreading, and spread meant gaps. Then came flak where flak was not supposed to be. The first burst felt like a distant concussion, more heard through the airframe than felt in the body. The second was closer, shaking frost from seams and making the bomber shudder as if it had hit turbulence. The gunners called it out, their voices rising slightly in pitch, and the engineer began scanning gauges for damage. The navigator's reaction was immediate and technical. If they were in flak here, they were over a defended area that wasn't on the plan for this leg. The Germans did not scatter heavy batteries at random. They placed them around key nodes, cities, industrial zones, rail junctions, and approach routes that bombers tended to follow. Unexpected flak was a sign of misrouting, and misrouting was almost always the product of drift compounded over time. A few degrees of error at the start of a mission felt harmless. A bomber could hold a slightly wrong heading for an hour and still believe it was on course because the world outside offered no contradiction. But over hours, those degrees became miles. Miles became separation from the stream's intended corridor. Separation meant that one portion of the force might slide toward a belt where German controllers expected strays. And once a group entered a more heavily defended area, it created a new problem. To correct back toward the planned route required turning, and turning in cloud carried collision risk, and turning could also place the group into an even worse position if the correction was wrong. This was the moral weight of navigation in bad weather. It wasn't simply math. It was the knowledge that a correction chosen under uncertainty could save dozens of aircraft or pull them into concentrated fire. The fighter encounters began in the same ambiguous way as everything else that day. Not with clear silhouettes, but with brief shapes and then tracers. A pair of bright lines rose from behind and below, cutting upward into the cloud layer. The tail gunner shouted a contact and began firing short bursts, the machine gun vibration humming through the fuselage. The pilot tightened his grip on the yoke but held formation discipline, reluctant to maneuver blindly. The bomber's gunners were trained to wait for a firm target, to conserve ammunition for the moments when it mattered. But cloud made firm targets rare. A fighter could appear for seconds, fire, and vanish. The gunners fired into the places where they believed the fighter would be, hoping their tracers would force a break off. In the nose, the navigator kept his head down and his pencil moving, because the only defense that could be sustained in cloud was coherence. A lone bomber could be hunted. A coherent box, even partially hidden, was harder to approach. Radio calls multiplied, and with them came the sense of a system straining. Someone reported flak at a certain time. Another reported it again 5 minutes later, suggesting multiple elements were crossing the same defended patch. A voice, clipped and tight, asked whether the stream had executed the correct turn at the last point. No one answered with confidence. The navigator realized that confusion was spreading the way drift spread, gradually, silently, through small discrepancies that no single person could see in full. Every crew saw only their slice of sky and their set of instruments. No one aboard any single bomber could see the bomber stream as a whole. That was why the stream could fail without anyone deciding to fail. The navigator attempted a radio fix again. working with the operator to pull in a beacon or a bearing. The signal was weak and unstable, wavering in the headphones like a voice trying to speak through water. He plotted the line anyway, then compared it to his dead reckoning. The two did not agree perfectly, but they suggested drift in the same general direction. He checked his wind triangle calculations and found that the forecast winds no longer explained the time losses. Either the wind was stronger than predicted or from a different quarter. If it was stronger, then every aircraft relying on the forecast would be drifting similarly. That meant their problem was not individual incompetence. It was a weather reality the plan had failed to anticipate. He faced the core decision: keep holding the planned heading and accept the growing evidence that the stream was sliding into a worse corridor, or recommend a correction that might bring them back towards safety, but might also fracture formation spacing further if executed poorly. He felt the moral dimension in his chest because he understood what his recommendation meant. Pilots trusted navigators because they had to, and in cloud that trust carried the weight of unseen aircraft near them. A sudden correction could surprise a neighboring ship, causing a collision. A gradual correction might be too slow to matter before the stream entered the heaviest defenses. The navigator chose what his training and temperament favored: disciplined boldness. Not a sharp turn, but a sustained correction held long enough to change the stream's track without introducing sudden geometry shifts. He spoke to the pilot in a voice that was calm because panic would only add another variable. He explained the evidence as clearly as he could: timing discrepancies, unexpected flak, weak bearing indications, likely wind shift. He recommended a correction of a few degrees and a revised estimate for the next turn. The pilot asked for confirmation twice, not because he doubted the navigator, but because in cloud every decision felt irreversible. The navigator confirmed. The pilot adjusted the heading gently, the bomber banking so slightly that the crew could feel it only as a change in seat pressure. The correction did not instantly remove danger. Flag bursts still appeared, and fighters still probed, but the pattern began to change. The flak became less concentrated, as if they were edging away from a belt rather than flying deeper into it. A shadow of another bomber appeared and stayed longer, suggesting the formation was not thinning further. The radio calls, though still strained, became less frantic, shifting from uncertainty to brief confirmations of headings and times. Nothing about the day became easy. Yet the causal chain that had threatened to unravel the stream, degrees into miles, miles into gaps, gaps into attacks, was being interrupted by a navigator's willingness to act without certainty. In that moment, the navigator understood the quiet cruelty of the air war. Courage was not always a man firing at an enemy he could see. Sometimes it was a man writing numbers on a chart while the aircraft shook under flak, choosing a correction that could not be proven until later, and accepting that the lives of strangers in nearby bombers might hinge on whether his pencil and his judgment were right. He recognized the pattern the way a man recognizes weather before it arrives. Not from one sign, but from several small signs that agreed with each other even when none of them were perfect. The bomber had been in cloud long enough that the sky outside no longer felt like a place, only a pressure against the plexiglass. Inside, the navigator's world was his chart table, the dim light, and a chain of numbers that had started neat and had become crowded with corrections. The mission plan had assumed one set of winds at altitude, stable enough that the stream could ride them like a river current. What he was seeing now was a current that had shifted, and the shift had been consistent. Leg after leg, the timing was off in the same direction. The planned turn points were coming late, then later. The aircraft's computed ground speed didn't match the forecast, and the discrepancy was too steady to be explained by momentary power changes or a single icing layer. It felt like being pushed sideways for hours. He did not have what every navigator wanted: a clean fix. No coastline, no reliable drift site, only brief and uncertain radio bearings that came through the interference like distant bells. Yet the interference itself told a story. When the radio operator managed to catch a beacon, the needle wandered before settling, as if the signal had been bent by the air mass and the geography beneath them. The navigator plotted the bearing anyway, pencil moving with the same deliberate pressure he had used in training, because a weak line was better than none if it could be compared with other weak lines. On the chart, the bearing did not intersect neatly with his dead reckoning position, but it did not disagree wildly either. It suggested the same kind of lateral drift his timing errors implied. Two imperfect sources pointing the same way mattered more than one perfect source that didn't exist. He began to rebuild the wind triangle with brutal patience. First, he stripped the problem down to what he could trust: true airspeed from the pilot's settings and the aircraft's performance, headings from the gyro that had been checked and rechecked, time measured by the stopwatch that had not failed him yet. He wrote the values, then computed an estimated wind that would produce the drift and ground speed he was observing. The number was not comfortable. It was stronger than the forecast and angled differently, the kind of wind that would slide an entire bomber stream sideways as if it were a net pulled by an unseen hand. If his aircraft was drifting like this, others were too, because the stream was flying under the same ceiling of cloud and the same upper air currents. Still, he refused to leap to a dramatic correction. That was where steadiness mattered. The farm boy in him understood how easy it was to overcorrect when you were behind the weather. Overcorrection could be as dangerous as neglect. A sharp turn might bring them back to track, or it might send them into the path of another formation element hidden in cloud. It might widen spacing so quickly that a box dissolved into singles. The navigator did not chase certainty. He chased a disciplined approximation. He ran the numbers again, adjusting for the icing-induced speed loss the engineer had reported. Then again, after confirming the pilot's power settings had been steady. Each recalculation narrowed the range of plausible winds. He compared the results and saw that despite small differences, the direction remained consistent. The stream was being pushed. The pilot asked for the next timing. The navigator gave it, then added, carefully, that their track was likely drifting and that he needed a minute to confirm. The pilot did not argue. In the calm of a long mission, pilots learned that the navigator's tone mattered more than his certainty. A voice that sounded panicked could infect a cockpit. The navigator kept his voice even. He asked the pilot for a brief straight and level segment to stabilize the numbers. The pilot obliged, maintaining heading while the navigator checked the gyro against the magnetic compass and noted the discrepancy. He accounted for it, then checked again. The compasses were not perfectly aligned, but they were stable, and stability was enough. He looked to the radio operator and requested another bearing attempt. Not a broad search, but a short, specific try on the most promising station. The operator worked the dial with gloved fingers and, after a tense pause filled with static, got a usable tone. The navigator plotted it quickly. The bearing again suggested they were left of planned track. Now he had a decision sequence that could be defended. He had timing drift, repeated over multiple legs. He had an inferred wind that explained it, and he had radio evidence that supported the drift direction. He did not have certainty about magnitude, and he could not see other bombers well enough to assess how far the box had already stretched. But he had enough to justify a correction. The correction needed to be bold enough to matter over hours, but not so abrupt that it shattered formation discipline. He selected a small heading change, held over time, designed to work like a slow lever rather than a sudden shove. 5 degrees could feel insignificant in the moment, but over an hour it moved in aircraft miles. If the whole element adopted it, it could rebuild the stream's alignment without causing immediate chaos. He delivered the recommendation to the pilot in plain terms: heading change, expected effect, and the time window in which they could reassess. The pilot repeated it back, then eased the bomber into the adjustment with the gentleness of a man turning a ship in a narrow channel. The aircraft banked slightly, engines holding steady, the horizon still invisible, but the instrument panel confirming the new heading. The navigator watched the clock and began the slow work of verification. If the correction was right, the next timing should tighten. If it was wrong, the discrepancy would grow. There was no dramatic feedback, only the steady approach of the next computed point. The next part was communication, and this was where the decision could become more than an individual act. A correction that lived only in one navigator's notebook could save one crew and still leave the stream fractured. But radio discipline and the risk of enemy direction finding meant messages had to be minimal and purposeful. The navigator and radio operator crafted a short report for the group chain, not an emotional claim, but a technical note. Observed drift, revised wind estimate, recommended correction. The wording was restrained, almost bureaucratic, because bureaucracy was the language that could move through command channels without argument. The radio operator transmitted it quickly and went quiet again. The navigator could not know who heard it. He could not know who trusted it. Yet within the next half hour, there were subtle signs of alignment returning. A dark shape appeared off the wing in a brief thinning of cloud and held position longer than before. Another appeared below and behind, suggesting the vertical stack was still intact. The radio traffic, sparse by design, carried fewer confused requests for position checks. Most telling, the timing began to tighten. The next turn point arrived closer to the expected minute. Not perfect, but improved. The inferred wind, recalculated from the new timing, suggested that the correction was taking effect. The navigator did not celebrate. He simply continued the process, because the atmosphere could still shift again. This was the turning point in the WW2 record sense. Not a sudden heroic act, but a rational correction made under pressure with incomplete information, communicated through discipline rather than bravado. The Farmboy's steadiness showed in what he refused to do. He refused to chase the illusion of a perfect fix. He refused to make the pilot's life harder with excessive numbers. He refused to ignore evidence because it was imperfect. He took what the sky offered, timing errors, weak bearings, a consistent drift, and turned it into a decision that preserved coherence. In the end, the bomber stream did not survive bad weather because it had superior courage. It survived because, in the moments when the cloud made the world blank, someone treated the blankness as a solvable problem and applied procedure until the stream began to look like a force again. The first sign that they were approaching the Berlin defensive zone was not a city on the horizon. It was discipline returning in small, measurable ways. The bomber stream, which the clouds had stretched and thinned into something fragile, began to compress again as headings aligned and timing windows narrowed. A dark shape would appear off the left wing for a few seconds, then another higher and farther back, each one confirming that the aircraft was no longer drifting alone through featureless gray. The navigator felt the difference most clearly in his own figures. The corrected wind estimate he had been carrying for hours began to match what the clock and the airspeed were finally producing. When dead reckoning and intermittent radio cues stop fighting each other, it does not mean the world is suddenly clear. It means a system has stopped bleeding accuracy. In a mass raid, that was as close to stability as a crew could expect. Cloud breaks came too late to be comforting. They opened in irregular patches like torn fabric, revealing brief slices of country below, and then sealing shut again. A river would flash into view, black and winding, then vanish. A cluster of roads would appear with a faint geometry of fields, then dissolve into the same gray. These glimpses were not long enough to build a reliable visual fix, but they were long enough to make the mission feel closer to the ground, to make the distance to enemy guns feel shorter. Men who had been staring at nothing for hours suddenly saw terrain, and the mind responded the way it always responds to proximity. Heartbeats rise, mouths go dry under oxygen masks, hands check equipment again without being told. The navigator treated the glimpses as a sanity check, not a solution. He marked a possible confirmation on his chart, then returned to the work that could be repeated. Time, heading, drift correction, and the careful management of a route that existed mostly inside his notes. Escort timing remained uncertain, but it stopped being hopeless. Fighters could not easily find a bomber stream hidden inside cloud, and the bomber stream could not easily find them either. Yet where breaks widened, the sky briefly showed movement at higher altitudes, small, fast silhouettes cutting across the pale ceiling, then disappearing again. The crew did not cheer. They simply noted what the presence implied. Someone had made contact. Some portion of the escort plan was still alive, and that mattered because it reduced the freedom of German fighters to concentrate without consequence. The Navigator listened to the radio operator's brief reports, each one stripped down to essentials, and he adjusted his expectations accordingly. A partial escort was not safety, but it was a change in the equation. German defenses tightened as the stream closed the last distance. Flak began to register not as occasional bursts in unexpected places, but as deliberate patterns that suggested the stream was entering a network designed specifically for large raids. In the cloud, flak did not always announce itself visually before it struck. Sometimes the aircraft would shudder, a blunt vibration passing through the fuselage, and only then would black bursts become visible in a gap. The engineer's voice, steady but alert, confirmed systems checks. Fuel pressure stable, oil pressure holding, hydraulic readings acceptable. The pilot held the aircraft as level as conditions allowed, because the closer they came to the target corridor, the more the mission demanded stability. Bombing geometry in a heavy bomber was unforgiving. The aircraft had to fly a predictable path long enough for the bombardier to align the solution, and in that window, the bomber's vulnerability was not romantic. It was mechanical. You could not weave without breaking the run. You could not dive without destroying formation spacing. You could not chase a threat without abandoning the purpose of being there. The Navigator's earlier correction manifested now in the most practical way possible. Other aircraft were present when they were supposed to be. Not perfectly, not in clean parade lines, but in numbers and spacing consistent with a functioning stream. Instead of arriving as a scattered trickle that German controllers could isolate and strip away, groups arrived in a usable flow. That flow meant overlapping defensive fire. It meant fewer lone bombers exposed on the edges. It meant fewer gaps wide enough for fighters to dive into without paying a price. It also meant the bomb run could be executed as an operation rather than as a series of individual survivals. The Navigator did not think of this as triumph. He thought of it as the difference between a bad day and a catastrophic one. Target markers were uncertain in the weather. Smoke and clouds swallowed signals that might have been obvious on a clear day. When the bombardier searched for a visual cue, he often found only shifting light. At times, the only guidance available was instrument-based. Timing over a computed point, the estimated approach angle, the reliance on procedural bombing when the ground refused to show itself. The Navigator and Bombardier worked in parallel. The Navigator's job was to ensure the aircraft was where the bombing plan believed it was. The Bombardier's job was to release at the correct moment within that plan. Their work was not dramatic. It was tense because it was quiet. The less they could see, the more each number mattered, and the more each number had to be defended against doubt. Fighters began to appear in bursts rather than in clear, sustained engagements. The cloud made long-range visual acquisition difficult, but it also provided cover for sudden approaches. A shape would flash at the edge of a break, then tracers would reach up from behind, probing the stream. Gunners fired short bursts at moments, not at confirmed targets, because confirmation was a luxury. The tail gunner reported a contact, then lost it, then reported another. The top turret traversed, searching for movement. In these moments, the crew's fear was controlled by procedure. The pilot held course. The engineer monitored engines. The Navigator kept time. The Bombardier stayed locked into the run. That discipline was not bravery in the cinematic sense. It was a commitment to the only strategy that allowed a bomber stream to function. Hold steady, endure the vulnerability, and trust that coherence would reduce exposure more than frantic motion could. Losses happened without spectacle. An aircraft that had been faintly visible through a break would vanish into cloud and not reappear. A dark smear of smoke would appear briefly below and then be swallowed by gray. The crew could not always tell whether a bomber had gone down or simply slipped into another layer. That uncertainty added a particular heaviness because it prevented the mind from closing accounts. Men stared into blank air and tried to imagine what was happening beyond sight. The navigator refused to indulge those imaginings. He kept his attention on what he could control, because the mission still had to be flown, and the distance home was still long. The wind, if it could be called that, was not a cleanly visible Berlin beneath clear skies. It was the fact that the stream remained coherent enough to deliver bombs and then turn away without dissolving into isolated pieces. Bomb release was felt more than seen. The aircraft lightened. A subtle lift as weight dropped away. The bombardier confirmed, and the navigator marked the time and estimated position, writing it down for the later debrief that would attempt to turn this gray, uncertain experience into reports and maps. Immediately after release, the run could not simply break into chaos. The stream had to turn, and turns in formation were their own test of coherence, especially in cloud. The pilot banked gently, cautious of unseen aircraft at his level. The navigator called headings and times with the calm of repetition. The gunners stayed vigilant. Flak continued for a while, then thinned as the stream moved away from the densest zone. Fighters still lurked, but coherence reduced their opportunities. A bomber protected by other bombers was never safe, but it was less alone. As the stream withdrew, the cloud closed again, returning the world to gray. Yet something had changed. The aircraft was still inside a larger body rather than drifting at its edge. The navigator's corrections, held for hours with no visual reward, had helped keep the stream from bleeding apart. The mission's outcome was imperfect. Weather ensured that, but it was an outcome that could be measured in the simplest terms that mattered to crews. A large portion of the force was still together, still moving homeward, still functioning as something more than a collection of isolated men in cold metal. In a war of systems, that kind of coherence was not glamorous. It was survival expressed as organization, and it was enough. After landing, the first sensation was weight. Not the weight of the aircraft, which settled onto the runway with a tired, uneven thump, but the weight that returned to the body the moment the engines began to wind down and the constant vibration stopped. Silence in a bomber base was never complete. There were always other engines, other crews, ground vehicles moving through mud. But for a crew stepping out of an oxygen-fed world, even ordinary noise felt distant and soft. The navigator climbed down with his chart case held close against his chest, not because it was precious in a sentimental way, but because it was the only complete record of what had happened when the sky erased landmarks. His gloves were stiff from cold, and when he peeled them off, his fingers were pale and slightly clumsy, as if they belonged to someone else. The cold had not been dramatic enough to feel like suffering while it happened. It had simply been present for hours, stealing dexterity and warmth one small piece at a time. And now the body noticed what it had lost. Inside the debriefing hut, the air smelled of damp wool, cigarette smoke, and weak coffee. The room was crowded with men who looked older than they had at takeoff, even the young ones, because fatigue sharpened the lines around eyes and pulled cheeks downward. There was no applause for making it back. Crews came in, set down helmets and flak vests, and waited for questions that would translate their experience into numbers and patterns. The navigator took a seat at a table under a hanging lamp and opened his charts. The paper was creased and marked with pencil corrections, notes written tight in the margins, time hacks, headings, small arrows showing drift. It looked less like a planned route and more like a living document that had survived a fight. He knew that some officers would look at the markings and see disorder. Others would see what it actually was. Adaptation, a record of judgment under imperfect information. The first questions were always practical. Where did you bomb? What did you see? What was the flak like? How many fighters? How much cloud? In clear weather raids, these questions could be answered with photographs and visual confirmation. Under heavy cloud, the answers were often partial. Target obscured became a phrase that appeared again and again, not as an excuse, but as an atmospheric fact. The navigator listened as the bombardier described brief openings, the way the bomb run was held stable despite turbulence. The moment of release felt more than seen. Someone from intelligence wrote it down, knowing that later bomb damage assessment might rely on fragments. A single photograph caught through a gap, a report from another group with a clearer view, the pattern of fires observed on the return leg. The navigator's contribution came when the discussion shifted from what was hit to whether the stream had remained coherent enough to be a stream at all. A staff officer asked about timing. The navigator answered in the language of his log. He provided the takeoff time, assembly delays, the moment the planned schedule began to slip under icing drag, the correction he computed when radio bearings and dead reckoning diverged, and the time the formation regained its planned corridor. He did not embellish. He did not describe it as genius. He described it as procedure. Repeated wind triangles, cross-checks between gyro and magnetic compass, estimates revised when evidence changed. He pointed to the penciled notes and explained how the drift appeared first as minutes lost and then as unexpected flak. He explained why a gentle correction held for an hour was safer in formation conditions than a sharp turn that could create collision risk in cloud. These were small statements, delivered without drama, but they mattered because they were measurable. The officers could compare his times against other crews' times. They could see whether multiple groups reported the same drift direction. They could determine whether the stream's fragmentation had been limited or whether it had dissolved into scattered aircraft. In a campaign built on repetition, this kind of analysis was how doctrine shifted without anyone announcing it. Bomb plots were laid out on tables like patient, silent witnesses, lines and circles, headings and estimated positions, each plot showing where a crew believed they had been at specific times. Under cloud, these plots often disagreed, not because crews were lying, but because the sky made certainty rare. Yet patterns could still emerge. If multiple plots showed drift toward the same side of the planned corridor, then the forecast wind had likely been wrong. If plots showed reconvergence near the same turning point, then the correction had spread through the chain, and the stream had rebuilt itself. The navigator watched the officers compare papers and felt a particular kind of relief that had nothing to do with personal pride. It was the relief of knowing that what he had done could be evaluated honestly. It could be checked. It could be verified or corrected. In a war where stories often inflated themselves in retelling, the navigator's work was something that left marks on paper. There was also the matter of losses. The room carried that weight even when no one spoke of it directly. Missing aircraft lists were posted elsewhere, but everyone sensed the tally building in the background. When an officer asked whether the formation had seen specific groups drop out, whether anyone had observed parachutes or flames, the navigator answered carefully, because cloud made observation uncertain. Sometimes all a crew saw was empty space where an aircraft should have been. Sometimes the only evidence was a faint smoke trail swallowed by gray. The navigator understood that his notes, his corrections, his insistence on keeping the aircraft aligned with the stream, were not just about getting bombs to the target. They were about preventing isolation, and isolation was where losses multiplied. He could not claim he had saved a specific crew. That would be dishonest. What he could say, and what his records could support, was that when the stream remained coherent, fewer aircraft were left alone. And when fewer were left alone, enemy fighters had fewer easy opportunities. That was how success was defined in weather like this. Not perfection, but reduced fragmentation and preserve timing alignment. When the debrief ended, the navigator stepped back into the colder air outside and felt the strange emptiness that followed intense concentration. In flight, every minute had been filled with checking, calculating, listening, correcting. On the ground, the mind suddenly had space, and into that space came delayed sensations. The ache in shoulders from hunching over the table, the dryness in the throat from hours on oxygen, the dull headache that often followed long missions. He walked back toward his billet with the chart case under his arm, boots crunching on gravel, and past other crews moving in the opposite direction, some heading to debrief, some returning, some simply standing around with the stunned stillness of men whose aircraft had been badly damaged. The base did not pause. Ground crews were already working on other bombers, refueling, patching flak holes, checking engines. The next day's schedule would be posted whether the crews felt ready or not. That night, the navigator cleaned his instruments and put his materials away with the same care he had used in the air. He sharpened pencils. He checked his slide rule. He folded charts along their creases so they would open quickly under stress. This was not obsession. It was routine, and routine was how men survived a job that asked for quiet competence under extreme pressure. He wrote a brief note in a personal notebook. Nothing dramatic, only the kind of private record a man kept to remind himself that the day had been real. Then he lay down on a cot and listened to the distant sound of the engines in the night, other aircraft lifting off or returning, the war continuing in a rhythm that did not care about individual fatigue. In the larger view, no single mission proved a capital could be reached. That proof had to be repeated until it became ordinary. The true change came from accumulated cases where discipline and calculation prevented raids from collapsing under weather, where navigators and pilots learned to treat cloud not as an inconvenience, but as an active threat that required its own tactics. In the smaller view, this raid was remembered by the men who flew it as a day when the world vanished and the only ground left was a set of numbers on a chart table. The navigator did not become a myth. He returned to his work. He carried the weight, then set it down, then picked it up again on the next mission. That was what large-scale operations depended on. Unglamorous competence repeated until it shaped outcomes. In the end, the difference between a raid and a disaster often lived in pencil marks. Small corrections made in the gray, held long enough to keep hundreds of aircraft moving as one.